So please welcome Keith D. Swenson.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be talking here today. I think programs such as this that allow us to talk about science-based topics are really, really important. So I hope I can live up to your expectations. This subject is an interest of mine. It's an avocation. I think you mentioned I have a degree in physics. I'm basically a computer scientist. But the whole understanding of complexity and complex systems has really interested me in recent years. But I would like to say, if I make a mistake, simply, raise your hand, point it out, because I do that a lot. And if you raise this as a question, it'll help everybody. We'll all benefit from that. So I do encourage you to do that. So the first question I have for you is, how many people here find that evolution is the best explanation for the profusion of life that we see around us? Okay, that is everybody. And that's what I expected. I expected everybody here would understand about evolution. So I'm not really going to talk about evolution. But what I'm going to talk about is maybe some of the psychological underpinnings. Why is it that people reject it? What's difficult about it? Why is this a special topic? Because for example, accepting that the Earth is round, accepting that the Sun is the middle of the solar system, these are ideas that are easily accepted by everybody, including things like the fact that there's a DNA molecule, and that DNA molecule, is the instructions for life. These are generally accepted across the board without regard to a religion. But evolution, on the other hand, is somehow a sticky topic. There's something special about it. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. Raise your hand if you believe in snowflakes. If you believe that snowflakes exist, that's my question, they exist. Is there anybody who does not believe that snowflakes exist? Okay, good. So we'll talk a little bit about that. My motivation was started in 2005, Kitzmüller versus Dover Area School District. This is where they put in motion to teach creationism, or a kind of creationism called intelligent design, in public schools. And again, I've got a background in science. I'm pretty open-minded. I believe that if you want to believe in an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific thing, I'm pretty much okay with people believing that. But when they go to indoctrinating children to a theory that has no evidence and no consensus, and when they present it cloaked as a scientific theory, that they've just gone too far. To me, I think evolution should be pretty obvious. I mean, it's a pretty obvious mechanism. It pretty obviously explains things. So why is there a controversy? And you can talk about the facts of evolution, but talking about just the facts doesn't matter. It's not facts. There's some emotional barrier that people have to accepting evolution. So what is that? What is going on there? Why is it that the intuition is against evolution in this case? So at the time that Ken Ham and Bill Nye had this debate, about 2 years ago, there were a bunch of pictures that circulated around sort of mocking the evolutionary stance, and this was one of them. And the sign there says, "Does not the second law of thermodynamics disprove evolution?" Well, what's interesting about this is that this is someone who obviously respects science in some sense. About 82% of the US population respects science. They do see science as a really good thing. And he's brought up the second law of thermodynamics. So he's really trying to make a sciencey argument about this. Now, the answer to his question, and I think you probably all know this, is that the Earth isn't a closed system. So the second law of thermodynamics says that in a closed system, entropy always increases. Now, entropy is the measure of disorder of a system. So increasing entropy means decrease in order. And that sort of says that entropy never decreases, order can never increase. It sort of seems to imply that everything runs down. Now, that's in a closed system, and that's where it is. What we'll find is that entropy doesn't have to be evenly distributed. There's nothing about the second law of thermodynamics that says that. But I'll go into that in a little more detail in a moment. The second one was this one. What mechanism of science has discovered that evidences an increase of the genetic information seen in any genetic mutation or evolutionary process. So the answer to this is we see this kind of thing all the time. But it seems kind of unbelievable because there's this idea that information has to come from intelligence. Okay, information is a magical thing, and intelligence is a magical thing that makes information. Mutations can either be beneficial or they can be bad for you, and both happen. And you've got the selector mechanism that tends to preserve the beneficial mutation. So mutations can add information. Now, the use of information here is a very colloquial term. It really means the amount of order in the system. That's what's meant by the speaker in this case, and that's what I'll use as well. If I talk about information today, I'm talking about the amount of order, the amount of different useful sequences in the DNA, that sort of thing. That's what we mean by increasing information. The third one was this young woman who said that if God did not create everything, how did the first single-celled organism originate?
Good question.
By chance. And you have to say it that way. You have to say by chance, Well, yeah, it was by chance, of course. But their understanding of chance is mistaken in this case. They're thinking about chance incorrectly. So I'll talk a little bit about chance and that misconception about evolution. Okay, so I went to talkorigins.org and I found the 5 major misconceptions about evolution. Quickly, evolution has never been observed. Evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. There's no transitional fossils. The theory of evolution says that life originated by chance, and evolution is only a theory. It hasn't been proven. So I'm not going to talk about all of these today, but I'm going to focus on these two, the question of the second law of thermodynamics and the random chance. And there's this idea, you've heard it before. A watch demands a watchmaker. Okay? Or does it? A painting demands a painter. Or does it? I mean, there's something that I really object to this argument, to compare a watch to a living system. Because watches don't get together with other watches and make baby watches. I mean, there's a huge difference between a living system and a watch. I mean, it may seem like it's really, really complicated, but it's nothing like a natural system. And there's this feeling that if something is complex, if it's complicated and organized, that it must come from an intelligence. And where does that come from? Why do we think that? It's a very compelling argument. And the reason is this. Things wear down. Things that people make wear down. If you look around you, everything around you, your car, your house needs to be repaired, your roof is going to have to be replaced at some point, your shoes wear out, your clothing wears out, roads have to be repaired, buildings have to repair, fences, everything around us wears out. And that's our experience. That's 99.9% of all of our experience is that maintenance is needed. This dominates our intuition. Our intuition is something like this. Things start out shiny and new and clean and looking nice and organized, and then later on, they get old and they get broken, and that's when we discard them and buy a new one, usually. So this is the intuition which is being applied to basically molecular systems. It's applied to everything. So you have to understand that that's the setting of this whole thing. If you search on the internet about the law of decay, okay, and if you exclude things about the law of radioactive decay, because there is a valid scientific theory about the law of radioactive decay, but if you exclude that, you'll find about half of the references go to Christian sites. And the Christians have really picked this up. I picked this up from christiananswers.net, and I'll read it to you. The second law of thermodynamics describes the basic principles familiar in everyday life. It is partially a universal law of decay, the ultimate cause of why everything ultimately falls apart and disintegrates over time. Material things are not eternal. Everything appears to change eventually and chaos increases. Nothing stays as fresh as the day one buys it. Clothing becomes faded, threadbare, and ultimately returns to dust. Okay, this is not what the second law of thermodynamics is about. But they picked this up, and they now call it a law of decay. Now the second law of thermodynamics has to do with statistical probability of distributions of molecules and atoms in spaces. They just tend to get more randomized. But that's what it's about. But latching on to this, whenever you hear a Christian talk about the second law of thermodynamics, just keep in your mind that this is what they're talking about. Well, some news. On the atomic scale, things don't wear out. Molecules can form, the atoms can come together, form a molecule, break apart. They can form again, they can break apart. We don't talk about whether the hydrogen atom is too worn out to make this molecule. It doesn't happen. You can't ask how old a hydrogen atom is because there's nothing different about any of the hydrogen atoms that are out there. So, molecules can break. Okay, they can form, they can break, but as far as I know, they can do this an infinite number of times. There's no friction at that level. Friction is something that happens at our level of reality. It just doesn't happen in molecules. So they don't rub against each other, they don't wear down. This intuition about things wearing out simply doesn't apply at the molecular level. Okay, well, I promised you a talk about snowflakes. So, admire the miracle that is a snowflake. Okay, we all know that snowflakes have a six-sided symmetry. And if you look at this, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's pretty complicated. It's pretty intricate in there. And you're seeing, and if you look at it, you can see imperfections. You can see it's not perfect, right? But it's pretty amazing that things all the way on one side of that crystal and on the other side are the same. Well, that might lead you to believe that we need some sort of intelligence making this. There was a character, you remember this? Jack Frost, right? Jack Frost was the idealization of what it was that made ice crystals because they were so amazing, you just had to have some intelligence behind it. And, I've done a little bit of research, even if you go to the creationist sites, even today, they don't believe in Jack Frost anymore. Now they know that crystals just grow, all by themselves. We can make it happen on demand. But how does it do this? So I'll talk a little bit about that and about how we don't need intelligent agent to do this, and then I'm going to apply that to some other areas of life. So the water molecule, H2O, two hydrogens, an oxygen. The oxygen's bigger than the hydrogens. The oxygen likes to steal the electrons from the hydrogen, so the oxygen tends to be negatively charged. The hydrogens tend to sit on the surface at 106 degrees. I don't really understand why it does that. It seems like they should go on opposite sides, but that's not what happens. It goes like this. And because you have charges that are separated by a distance, anytime you take two charges and separate them by a distance, you're going to have an electric field. So this is an electric dipole field. Every single little water molecule has a little electric dipole field around it. And that makes, that field interacts with the other molecules around it. So what happens is that these molecules tend to line up in patterns like this, sort of hexagonal shape, kind of tetrahedral shape. 106 degrees is, for a perfect hexagon, you need 120 degrees, but 106 is close enough. And so it tends to form these shapes. The molecules, because of their charges, they just tend to come together that way. So when you look at a lot of them, they're going to make this kind of hexagonal grid as the electrons go in there. Now the way a crystal forms is that you've got the crystal, but you've got this gas around it, and all these molecules are bumping into it all the time. Well, the electric fields of all the different molecules in there will add and subtract from each other, because you can add electric fields and subtract them. Now, I went and tried to look up the actual, what the field would actually look like, and I don't know anybody who's calculated that or made that available. So this is conceptual. So you can imagine there's some sort of field lines that are going to come out of this mass of molecules. And those field lines are going to make regions where the molecules are likely to stick or not likely to stick. And again, this is empirically designed. I don't know the math behind it, but we know that You can sort of think of these regions where the lines are closer together. That's sort of the green spots, which are kind of attractive. And then the flat faces tend to be not so attractive, okay? So, and if you have an irregular shape like this, sort of notice what's happening down here is this irregular shape tends to create, lots of sites where molecules can stick. So what, happens is that the molecules tend to want to fill in those spaces. They want to fill it in until you fill it out to be a nice shape like that. And then where do the molecules go? Well, they're gonna go on the end, and that's gonna make another irregular shape, and it's either gonna fill in the irregular shape or it's gonna project out the points. So that's the mechanism, just the shape of the molecules, the electrostatics, bumping into each other and sticking is how the crystal forms. And you can see on this snowflake, it started forming as a plate. It went as a plate for a long time, and then it started making these dendrites, the little spiky things that come out. Now, why is that? Well, the crystal drifted from one part of the air that had a certain temperature and a certain humidity, and it drifted into another area where the temperature was different and the humidity was different. And because the crystal remains, it is a solid, it all goes there together, the little tips started growing the dendrites on all 6 tips at the same time, because the entire crystal is in one region at a time. And it may drift back into a region that grows, again, the plates again. So there'll be plates, there'll be dendrites. There's a bunch of different ways that crystals can grow. It depends on your temperature on the bottom. It depends on your saturation of water. And there's this curve here. It can form small plates, it can form the dendrites, it can form these prisms, these hollow columns, these needles. There's a bunch of different ways that ice crystals can grow. And so what's happening with each snowflake is it's taking a unique path through these different regions, and it's growing in a unique way. And this explains why all snowflakes are unique. In fact, there's so many different ways it can grow. They almost are completely unique. There's nothing that guarantees that. You could have 2 snowflakes that come out exactly the same. And I'm sure if you look long enough, you might be able to find a couple. But you'd have to look for a long time. It's because the path that they take is unique. So here's one that started growing as a dendrite. It was in a region of the atmosphere, which started making little spiky things. And then it drifted into a region that wanted to grow plates. And so you can sort of see that out at the edges, it started growing plates again. And again, you look at it, it's not perfect, but you can sort of understand how the different parts of the crystal are growing at the same time, and that makes them so symmetric, without any intelligence needed. And that's the message here, is that this is a marvelously elaborate, complex structure. And we know the mechanism behind it. And we know that this is more organized than the water molecules that were there before. They started out disorganized, and they organized themselves. There's nothing else in there than the molecules doing that organizing. They literally organize themselves. Well, you've probably heard this one. The likelihood of, pick your favorite irreducible complexity thing. The likelihood of an eyeball forming is the same as a tornado going through a junkyard and constructing a 747. And this is a specious trope at best, because things like DNA don't just form all at once. Things like an eyeball don't just magically come together the way you would if you were Harry Potter and you waved a magic wand at it. In fact, there's a process that goes through with it. And so that's sort of the misunderstanding of probability. Let's play along with this idea just a little bit here. What's the probability that a snowflake would form? Okay, the average snowflake has about 10 to the 18th molecules. And what you can do is a simple probability calculation. You can say, what's the probability of the molecule being here? There's 1. The probability of something being right next to it, say 1 in 100. It could be anywhere in the space, but it's right here, 1 in 100. The next one, what's the probability of being right here? 1 in 100, right? So you can do the math, and you end up with the probability of a snowflake just forming randomly by chance is a number that's like, I don't know, 1 with 10 to the 100th of zeros after it. It's a number that's so ridiculously large, it couldn't possibly happen. I mean, if it happened once in the life of the universe, that would be it. You would never expect it to happen twice. And that's because snowflakes don't just form randomly. They don't just boom together as a random operation. There's a process involved. Now, randomness is part of it. Okay? The gases are randomly moving around, and the crystal is here, and they're bombarding this. So that randomness is really important. But at the same time, there's a process which is selecting. There's a selector process, which basically says when they hit the point where they could stick, they stick. And when they hit the other points, they don't. And so that selector, it's the randomness together with the selection process that causes order to be created out of disorder. And it happens naturally all the time. So they're not random similes, they are... sorry, the comment about this is that while it's impossible for a snowflake to come together randomly, they happen all the time. There's about 10 to the 38th snowflakes that fall on the Earth every year. Okay, so it's random motion together with a process. And this is a pattern that we're going to see in a lot of complex systems. You're going to have a certain amount of randomness, you're going to have a selector process. And you all know that's what happens in evolution. You know, you've got new generations being formed, there's randomness in there, and it's really fascinating because it's not just that cosmic rays come in and alter the DNA. There's a mechanism in there that when an animal is going to reproduce, it swaps the genes back and forth. It doesn't just take the mom's genes or the dad's genes. It actually swaps individual genes back and forth specifically to randomize the combinations so that the offspring come out significantly more random than they would by anything else. And that causes lots of different experiments. Some of them live, some of them die, and you know what happens. The successive genes get passed on. So that's the process that causes order to appear out of disorder. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about existence. I asked you if you believed that snowflakes exist, and they do. When for a given snowflake, there must be a point in time that there was no snowflake, right? And then there's another point in time when it exists, okay? We call that creation. And then there was a point in time when the snowflake's gone, and that is destruction. Okay, so the snowflake didn't exist, and then it does exist. So it came into existence. What does it mean to exist? Here we have a sort of a before and after. On the left, you've got water vapor floating around. And on the right, you've got the snowflake. Now, it's the same molecules in both cases. We haven't created any new molecules here. Okay, no molecules were harmed in the forming of this snowflake. All we've done is organize them. We've organized them. We've taken them from random patterns, but through, again, this process of selection, we've organized them. And because they're organized, we now say the snowflake exists. So it's a form, actually. The existence of the snowflake is just a form of the matter that was there before. And we're also going to see this a lot, that in fact things do come into existence all on their own without any help from anything outside. I'll give you a couple other examples of that, but the molecules were already there. The only thing that was created was the form, and it's the persistence of the form, which is really interesting. I mean, the same thing's true with us, right? Our bodies. You know that your body is replacing your skin all the time, replacing everything in your body. It's this pattern that exists, and you can think of the matter kind of flowing through us. But the fact that we have this persistent pattern that is able to hold itself together for a good number of years, that is quite amazing about it. Okay, so what is it that really did create the snowflake? You had to have the right conditions. Obviously, a snowflake is not going to form on a beach in Jamaica. Okay, you have to have an atmosphere, you have to have, the right temperature, you have to have water up there, that's clear. But the clouds and the cold winds are important, but they don't actually, in any real sense, cause the snowflake to form. In other words, what makes a snowflake here and not here? What decides that? Often it's triggered by a speck of dust. A lot of snowflakes have a speck of dust or a piece of pollen at the core, and that's a trigger. That starts the growing of the snowflake, but that doesn't cause the snowflake in any realistic sense. I mean, it doesn't, other than providing a form for the crystal to start, the crystal itself grows and elaborates far beyond the dust or the pollen would. And of course, the electrostatic field is important, as I explained that, and the physicality of the molecule determines the shape of the crystal. But actually, and this is what I would put to you, and this is the central idea of the talk, the molecules and their motions that build the snowflake are the very same molecules that are the snowflake. It's created by itself. It organizes itself. There's no external entity that comes in and says, you are going to have dendrites now, right? I mean, it is self-organizing. So self-organizing, perhaps even self-creating if you want to take that. So we know now that we don't need fairies carving the ice. We don't need an intelligence behind this. We know that there's a simple, easy mechanism that causes this order to come out of disorder. And that's very non-intuitive. It's very non-intuitive. If I'd asked you all, do you think order just creates itself? At the beginning of the talk, you probably would have come back and said, I'm not so sure I believe in that. Even scientists, even hardcore scientists have a hard time grasping this. But that seems to be a property of the universe. It's a very unsettling idea, the idea that things can create themselves, or at least organize themselves. It's intuitively difficult. But if you look around, there's all sorts of things that are like this. You may even have some in your home, believe it or not. It's not intuitive because if you think about taking a bunch of Lego pieces and jumbling them around, they're not going to build something all by themselves. But again, I would say Lego pieces are man-made. They don't compare to the kind of things that you see in nature. So it's, again, a stretched analogy. I've been looking at this subject for a number of years, and this year I went to the, if you ever get a chance to go to Munich, there's a nice museum there called the Deutsches Museum. And down on the ground floor, they had an exhibit on self-organizing systems. And I thought that was great because I haven't ever seen one in America. Okay, there probably are someplace. I certainly don't know everything. But I was very pleased to find an entire exhibit talking about self-organizing things and how they work and this because it includes cells and DNA and all that kind of stuff. So it exists. It's out there. Understand that it's there. What else do we have that's self-organizing? Well, what about a whirlpool? Whirlpool, what is it? It's a hole in the water, okay? It's a place where the water falls down and more water falls behind it. And of course it tends to swirl, so that sort of leaves a cavity there. And of course this is some sort of little dam. Like there's a little dam there and the water's flowing through there. So, you have to have some sort of certain conditions that exist before whirlpool comes along. But who created that whirlpool? Do we need an intelligence to put that together? No, it creates itself. It creates all by itself. And there's no denying that the whirlpool exists, even though there's nothing there but the water. There's nothing been added to the water to make that whirlpool. It's just a form that came into existence. Another really common one is a hurricane. Okay, this is a picture of Hurricane Katrina. I know a lot of people think that Katrina was formed because the people in New Orleans were bad. Okay, but we don't need that. We know what hurricanes are formed by. The sun hits the ocean causes water vapor to go up into the air. Because of the spinning earth, you have the Coriolis effect. The Coriolis effect tends to spin this form. As it goes on, it picks up energy because more water vapor is coming off the ocean, and it builds and builds and builds. And there's no question that hurricanes exist. Again, it's the same atmosphere that was there before. It's the same air that was floating over the ocean. But now, it's a storm. And the storm does a lot of destruction. And eventually, it will go away. It came from nothing. It'll eventually go away. And there's no little pieces of hurricane left around. I mean, it just dissipates. So this is something that is created and destroyed all on its own. I know some people disagree with that. I had to put this, I ran across this one. I found that rather amusing. I have no idea what it means, other than I thought it was a funny picture. Another example of self-organization is consciousness. And this is, again, there's a lot of sort of mystical beliefs behind consciousness, but if you think about it, it's really just another self-organizing system. Neurons connect, these connects affect other connections, and this is a whole complete other lecture, so I can't really go into this, but we can see consciousness emerging in the same way that snowflakes and hurricanes do. There's another type of self-organizing system which you probably have in your house, or certainly at least in your backyard. And these are plants. Think about, what is a plant doing? Well, it's grabbing carbon dioxide from the air and it's converting it into wood. It's converting it into its own structure. It's organizing itself. Now you may say, oh, but this was started by a seed. And it's true. The seed sets in place the pattern, and that's a very important thing for living systems. But the tree, or the plant, or the animal, whatever it is, grows all on its own. You don't have to have any intelligence coming around saying, oh, it's time to pop out a leaf here. And again, we used to believe in fairies. We used to believe that fairies existed to pull the leaves out of the ends of the trees. We now know that this happens all on its own. And it's another example of a self-organizing system. And it's a kind of a special case. Life is a special case of a self-organizing system. So you've got self-organizing systems, and then you have replicating systems. To be life, it's not just good enough to self-organize. Snowflakes self-organize, but they don't have anything like evolution, because snowflakes don't reproduce. They don't produce offspring. So to have life, you need to have a reproducing system, self-replicating system. And if you do, you have that. You have a big tree of life and the way evolution works, and it all sort of makes sense. And we've addressed, I think, the intuitive barriers. This is kind of the message I want to get out. There's something else really interesting that happened. There's this guy, Jeremy England, young math professor at MIT, and he wrote this paper in Journal of Chemical Physics about 3 years ago. And there was a summary of that paper. I actually got the paper, I tried to read it, but it's really complicated. Read the Scientific American article, it's much better, much more accessible, I'll say. And what he's discovered is that if you look at probabilities, what he looks at statistical probabilities of large sets of systems, and what he found is that replicating structures, from a mathematical basis, replicating structures represent a lower energy state. Now, if you know anything about nature and physics, things try to find low energy states. They tend to drift into lower energy states. What he basically said is that these replicating systems that can make copies of themselves, happen to be lower energy states than systems that don't, which means that they're likely to form. And this is his quote: "Clumps of atoms surrounded by a bath at some temperature, like the atmosphere of the ocean, should tend over time to arrange themselves to resonate better and better with sources of mechanical, electromagnetic, and chemical work in their environments." This comes from the math. This doesn't come from the fine structure constant or the ratio of the charge to mass of atoms. There's nothing special about a universe. If what he says is true, it's quite likely that all universes will have life, because it's a fundamental fact of mathematics. I don't know. England argues that under certain conditions, matter will spontaneously self-organize. This tendency could account for the internal order of living things, as well as many inanimate structures as well. So this is exciting stuff. You start with a random clump of atoms, and you shine light on it for long enough, you should not be surprised that you get a plant. I just stretch it a little bit and think about this. Self-organizing systems, they're all around us. They happen all the time. They're not intuitive, though, but they do. Let me summarize a little bit what I touched on. This idea, everything wears out. Well, not on a molecular scale, it doesn't. Atoms and molecules can come together and part millions and billions of times. I mean, transcriptase, which is the thing that copies your DNA, does trillions of nucleotide sequences, makes no mistakes, just keeps on going. Now, they can break, but they don't ever wear out. There's no friction at that level. Watchmaker demands a watch, painting demands a painter. Well, of course, these are man-made things. Man-made things tend to be like this. It's nothing like a molecular system. It's nothing like a living system. Nature is so much grander than a watch or a painting. It's ridiculous to compare them. Things just don't appear on their own. Well, they do. They do. Snowflakes appear on their own. Hurricanes appear on their own. Whirlpools do. There's lots and lots of things that just appear on their own. We don't need pixies. We don't need elves. We don't need fairies. We don't need intelligent agents to bring these into existence. The properties of the universe make these things self-organize. Things don't organize themselves without an external intelligent agent acting on them. Okay, so which intelligent agent creates snowflakes? Okay? Which one spins hurricanes? Which one makes leaves appear on the tree? Another one, which one causes valleys to form in just the way to deliver water to the oceans? Another one, we know there's a natural process to that, and if you look at the natural process, you can see what it is. Universal law of decay, okay, there is no such thing. That's something that we tend to experience at our level of reality, but entropy has nothing to do with the kinds of decay that we experience. So don't confuse man-made things with natural phenomena. Every system left to its own device always tends to move from order to disorder. Well, okay, it's only net entropy that increases. All right. So in a closed system, a snowflake might form. That's an increase in order, which is a decrease in entropy, right? Well, as this snowflake becomes more organized, it's actually giving off heat. That heat is increasing the disorder someplace else. So, second law of thermodynamics is not violated by the fact that snowflakes form, because it talks about net entropy, and you have to consider the whole system. Same thing's true with, and we know this, you have a baby. So the baby represents order that was not there before. And if you had a baby, you know that everything around it gets significantly disorganized. So the disorder is not smoothly or equally distributed. That's it. Some parts get organized, other parts get disorganized, and that's why order can form without violating the second law of thermodynamics. This point I didn't talk about, but I think it's worth bringing up at least, that evolution is contrary to God, and they're different subjects. Okay, there's nothing about evolution and these organizing systems that says anything about the existence or non-existence of God. So I just want to separate those two topics, and maybe we can try to do that so that at least we can move forward and get people to understand evolution a little bit more without feeling a threat that this is threatening their beliefs. It shouldn't be threatening their beliefs. All right, so that's basically it. I talked about the emotional reactions to evolution. I talked about the law of decay. I talked about how snowflakes form. What is existence? What is a creation? How do things self-organize? Some examples of those. I talked about life, replicating structures, and some common questions and answers. I also have been publishing some books, and Mitch Steinman's a local philosopher. Darwin's Apple, very interesting book. I don't know if you've talked to him, but a couple of these other things. And finally, that leaves us open to Q&A. Thank you.